the forgotten main battle tank of India that brought nothing but shame to its creators. 1962 was an absolute disaster for India, and the cause wasn't monsoon floods, famine, or epidemics. It was a humiliating military defeat in the Himalayas. The Chinese army steamrolled Indian forces in just a few weeks, retaining control of about 38,000 square kilometers of disputed territory in the Aksai Chin region. India's 4th Infantry Division suffered devastating losses. Thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner, and those who survived retreated in a panic along frozen mountain trails through biting wind. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who just recently had been delivering passionate speeches about the great destiny of independent India, now looked aged and broken. The country was desperate for change, and above all, the army needed modern weapons that could stand up to the Chinese threat and settle old scores with Pakistan. Even before this devastating defeat, the Indian government had been in talks to build its own tank industry, because the country was critically short on armor, and what little they had were outdated British Centurions left over from the colonial era. In 1959, delegations from several European countries showed up in New Delhi with offers of cooperation. The Germans pitched their designs, but the frontrunner was the British firm Vickers, which went further than anyone else. They promised to build an entire factory in India to produce the tanks locally. For a young nation that had only gained independence from the British Empire 12 years earlier, this was a tempting offer. India wanted to become an industrial power, a country that builds its own weapons instead of buying them abroad. In August 1961, a landmark contract was signed between the Indian government and Vickers. The British committed to designing a main battle tank specifically for India, building prototypes at their own factories, delivering the first 90 finished vehicles, and then constructing a modern tank factory in the city of Avadi, near Madras, while handing over all the necessary documentation and technology. The German competitors lost the bid, and the reasons the British won weren't purely technical. After all, the ties between the former colonial power and its former colony remained remarkably close. The tank that was supposed to become the backbone of India's armored might received the factory designation Vickers and was built using components and assemblies from existing British Centurion and Chieftain tanks. In essence, the British offered India a mashup of proven solutions packed into a thinner, cheaper hull rather than anything revolutionary. The 105mm rifled gun was the same one used on the Centurions. The engine and transmission were borrowed from the Chieftain. The fire control system was also pulled straight from existing British designs. Vickers openly admitted that their tank was built as a simple, affordable machine for export to developing countries that couldn't afford pricey modern vehicles like the Chieftain itself. The first prototype was ready by 1963, and one of the two that were built was immediately shipped to India for trials, while the second stayed in England for further development. Testing showed that the vehicle met the tactical and technical requirements, although Indian military officials flagged several issues with performance in hot climates. The British promised to sort everything out in the production models, and manufacturing kicked off at the Vickers plants in Elswick. The first batch of finished tanks was shipped by sea to India in 1965, and these vehicles were given the Indian name Vijayanta, which means victorious in Sanskrit. The name was deliberate. This tank was supposed to bring victory to the Indian Army in future battles. In January 1965, the first tank assembled on Indian soil rolled off the line at the heavy vehicles factory in Avadi, though most of the components were still shipped in from Britain. It was a moment of celebration for the entire nation. Newspapers declared a new era in Indian defense. Politicians gave triumphant speeches about a technological breakthrough. Nobody suspected back then that this tank would have a long and deeply troubled life, that it would see bloody wars and eventually become a source of embarrassment for the people who built it. Ahead lay the deserts of Rajasthan, the swamps of East Bengal, and the sacred walls of the Golden Temple in Amritsar. Vickers engineers went with a classic layout, one that had been proven over decades of tank design. Up front in the hull, welded from rolled armor plate, sat the driver's compartment, with the driver offset to the right. To his left was an ammo rack holding 25 rounds for the main gun. A pretty risky design choice, since a hit to the left side of the hull could set off the shells and turn the tank into a death trap for the crew. The other 3 crew members sat in the welded turret, where the commander and gunner were positioned to the right of the gun and the loader worked on the left. This setup demanded tight coordination and proper training, because in the cramped turret space, any mistake could cost you precious seconds in combat. The Vijayanta's main weapon was a British 105mm rifled gun with a barrel length of 56 calibers, capable of firing standard tank rounds at a rate of up to 12 rounds per minute. The ammo load was 44 rounds, more than enough for a prolonged engagement. A 2-plane gun stabilization system allowed firing on the move, which was a serious edge over many tanks of that era. That said, the fire control system was no different from what you'd find on early versions of the Centurion and Chieftain, meaning the Vijayanta was born with outdated electronics from day one. Range finding relied on a ranging machine gun paired with the main gun, which fired a burst of 3 tracer rounds. The gunner would adjust his aim based on where they landed. This method was already outdated even by 1960s standards, when laser rangefinders were starting to show up on Western vehicles. Secondary armament consisted of 2 7.6 2mm machine guns, one coaxial with the main gun, and the other mounted on the commander's cupola for engaging aircraft and infantry. The tank's armor protection raised eyebrows among military experts from the very start. The front of the hull and turret was only 80mm thick, the sides had 60mm of steel, and the rear was covered by a mere 20mm plate. For comparison, tanks from other countries at the time had significantly heavier armor, and the American Pattons in service with the Pakistani Army were also better protected. Vickers justified this by saying they needed to keep the vehicle's weight down to around 38.6 tons to ensure decent mobility on the weak bridges and soft ground of the Indian subcontinent. The heart of the tank was a 2-stroke, 6-cylinder Leyland L60 diesel engine, putting out 540 horsepower, mated to a Merritt Brown TN12 transmission with 6 forward gears and 2 reverse. This powertrain was borrowed from the Chieftain and was considered reasonably reliable for its day. The entire power pack could be swapped out in the field in about 90 minutes, which was a huge advantage when you're operating far from repair depots. Top speed on roads hit 48 kilometers per hour, and the range was 530 kilometers, allowing for long marches without refueling. To put that in perspective, you could drive one from Delhi to Jaipur and back without stopping for gas. The suspension used individual torsion bars, with 6 dual rubber-tired row wheels per side, and hydraulic shock absorbers on the first, second, and sixth wheels. One interesting feature of the Vijayanta was the ability to cross water obstacles using a special flotation kit with a frame-type design, similar to those used on Centurions. On water, the tank moved by churning its tracks through the water at a whopping 6.5 kilometers per hour. But the ability to ford rivers without bridges was still valuable in a theater of operations full of waterways. In practice, though, this gear was rarely used, since setting up the flotation equipment took time and a well-trained crew. Meanwhile, tank production at Avadi was ramping up slower than planned. Indian workers and engineers were still getting the hang of the complex technology. Assembly quality left a lot to be desired, and parts deliveries from Britain were constantly running late. When another war with Pakistan broke out in September 1965, the Vijayanta was completely unprepared for it. There were too few vehicles, crews hadn't finished proper training, and the tank basically sat out that conflict entirely. The Indian Army fought with old Centurions and tanks urgently purchased from Moscow. It was the first disappointment tied to the Vijayanta, but far from the last. December 1971 finally gave the Vijayanta its chance to prove itself in combat. The Third Indo-Pakistani War erupted over events in East Pakistan, where the Bengali population had risen up against Islamabad's rule and faced brutal crackdowns from the Pakistani army. Millions of refugees poured across the border into India, creating a humanitarian catastrophe and giving New Delhi a clear justification for stepping in militarily. By this point, the Indian Army had around 300 Vijayanta tanks in service, and command decided to throw them into the fight on the Eastern Front, where the goal was to crush the Pakistani force and liberate the territory that would become Bangladesh. Lieutenant General Jagjit Singh Arora, commanding Indian forces in the east, went with a rapid blitz-style offensive designed to deny the enemy any time to set up a proper defense. The 8th, 28th, and 57th Infantry Divisions, reinforced with Vijayanta tank units, launched attacks from multiple directions at once, bypassing fortified positions and racing toward Dhaka. Indian tankers used classic breakthrough tactics, exploiting gaps in the enemy's defenses and steering clear of drawn-out battles for strong points. Pakistani forces in East Pakistan were already demoralized by Bengali guerrilla actions and never saw such a lightning strike from a conventional army coming. The Vijayanta held up pretty well in the marshy terrain and countless rivers of Bengal. Its relatively light weight let it cross bridges that couldn't have supported heavier tanks, and its mobility on flooded rice paddies turned out to be decent thanks to wide tracks and good weight distribution. Crews quickly got comfortable with their machines under combat conditions, though plenty of them noted the lack of adequate protection against anti-tank weapons. The Pakistani army in this region had outdated American Chaffee tanks that were no match for the Indian machines. The Vijayanta's 105mm gun could punch through their armor at any realistic combat range, while the Chaffee's 76mm guns were practically useless against the Indian tanks. On the Western Front, it was a completely different story. Here, Indian tankers went up against American Pattons, packing 90mm guns and thicker armor. The fighting in the deserts of Rajasthan and the plains of Punjab was fierce, and the Vijayanta took heavy losses. The battle at the Basantar River in mid-December was especially brutal, where Indian tank units slammed into stubborn Pakistani defenses, dug in behind minefields and anti-tank positions. Engineer units cleared paths through the minefields under enemy fire, while tanks provided cover and knocked out gun emplacements. In this battle, 21-year-old 2nd Lieutenant Arun Ketarpal of the 17th Pune Horse particularly distinguished himself, commanding a Centurion tank named Famagusta. His unit attacked Pakistani armored positions near the village of Jarpal, and the young officer personally took out 4 enemy Pattons in a fierce head-on engagement, contributing to the destruction of 10 enemy tanks in total. When his tank took a hit and caught fire, command radioed Ketarpal to pull back, but he replied that the enemy was too close and there was nowhere to go. The lieutenant kept firing from his burning tank until he ran out of rounds and died at his post. He was posthumously awarded India's highest military decoration, the Param Veer Chakra, and his courage became a symbol of Indian tanker bravery in that war. All told, the Battle of Basantar cost the Pakistani side 48 tanks, while Indian losses came to just 10 vehicles. This victory opened the road for further advance and dealt a serious blow to Pakistan's armored force in the region. On the Eastern Front, things moved even faster, and on December 16th, the Pakistani garrison in Dhaka surrendered along with 90,000 soldiers and officers. It was the greatest military disaster in Pakistan's history, and at the same time a triumph for the Indian Army, one in which the Vijayanta played its part. The tank had finally earned its name, though the price was steep, and many of its kind were left burning on the battlefields. 13 years later, the Vijayanta would take part in an operation that permanently stained its reputation and became one of the darkest chapters in independent India's history. The war hero was about to become a villain. In the summer of 1984, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi ordered the storming of the Golden Temple in Amritsar, the holiest site for Sikhs worldwide. Inside the temple complex, charismatic preacher Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale had barricaded himself with his armed followers, who were demanding the creation of an independent Sikh state called Khalistan. Negotiations had hit a dead end. Tensions had been building for months, and the government decided to use force. The operation was codenamed Blue Star and kicked off in early June. Army units under Lieutenant General Kuldip Singh Brar surrounded the temple complex, which, on top of the militants, was packed with thousands of peaceful pilgrims who had come to mark the anniversary of the martyrdom of Guru Arjan. The military expected a quick surrender but badly underestimated how prepared and well-armed the defenders were. The temple's defense had been organized by Major General Shabeg Singh, a former Indian Army officer who'd been dismissed from service one day before his retirement. Embittered by that experience, he'd thrown in his lot with the Sikh separatists and turned the ancient walls into a genuine fortress with carefully planned firing positions and weapon stockpiles. The assault began on the night of June 5th and immediately went sideways. Infantry units trying to enter the complex were met with a wall of automatic fire and rocket-propelled grenades. Casualties among soldiers piled up by the hour, and progress was measured in meters. Bhindranwale's fighters knew every corner and corridor of the temple. They used rooftops and galleries to set up crossfire that cut the attackers to pieces. Armored personnel carriers brought in to support the infantry turned out to be sitting ducks for anti-tank grenades, and one was knocked out by a direct RPG hit. By the evening of June 5th, command realized the temple couldn't be taken without heavy armor. General Brar called for tank support, and around 7 p.m., 7 Vijayanta tanks from the 16th Cavalry Regiment rolled toward the temple complex through the main entrance near the clock tower. It wasn't an easy call. They were about to shell a site sacred to millions. But the military concluded they had no other choice. Through the night, the tanks moved into position and received orders to open fire on the Akal Takht, the spiritual seat of the Sikh faith, where the bulk of the defenders were holed up. At dawn on June 6th, the Vijayantas opened up with high explosive rounds. Their 105mm guns methodically tore apart ancient walls that had stood for centuries and survived countless invasions. The thunder of cannon fire echoed over the sacred pool of Amritsar, which gave the city its very name, and columns of smoke and dust rose above the crumbling Akal Takht. Pilgrims caught in the crossfire took cover wherever they could. Many were killed by shelling or stray bullets. The exact number of civilian casualties has never been established. Official figures put it at several hundred dead, but independent estimates placed the toll many times higher. By the morning of June 7th, resistance was broken. The bodies of Bhindranwale, Shabeg Singh, and other rebel leaders were found in the ruins of the Akal Takht. The army had accomplished its mission, but at a staggering cost. The destruction of the sacred temple set off a wave of outrage among Sikhs around the world. Hundreds of Sikh soldiers mutinied in their units and marched toward Amritsar to avenge the desecration of their holiest shrine. They were stopped by other army units in firefights on the roads. Dozens of soldiers were killed, and more than 2,600 mutineers were arrested and court-martialed. Retribution caught up with Indira Gandhi on October 31st of that same year, when 2 of her Sikh bodyguards gunned down the Prime Minister in the garden of her own residence. The assassination triggered anti-Sikh pogroms in Delhi and other cities, killing thousands. The Vijayanta, built to defend the country from outside enemies, had become a tool of internal bloodshed. A symbol of a tragedy that tore Indian society apart, the tank named Victorious won a victory that many in India would rather forget. After the tragic events in Amritsar, Indian military leaders took a hard look at the future of their tank fleet. By the mid-1980s, the Vijayanta no longer cut it on the modern battlefield, and command kicked off a large-scale modernization program called Bison. Engineers planned to fit the tanks with a new fire control system, featuring a laser rangefinder and electronic ballistic computer, swap out the obsolete ranging machine gun for modern optics, and add night fighting capability using electro-optical sights with infrared searchlights. New armor-piercing, fin-stabilized rounds were added to the ammo loadout, capable of defeating modern armor at longer ranges. The vehicle's protection also needed work, so 3-section anti-heat screens were developed for the hull sides, designed to prematurely detonate shaped charge warheads before they could reach the main armor. Smoke grenade launchers were mounted on the turret sides, 6 per side, letting the crew instantly pop a smokescreen and vanish from enemy observation. The most ambitious plans called for fitting Kanchan composite armor, developed for India's newest Arjun tank, swapping the engine for a more powerful unit from the T-72, and adding a navigation system. Originally, about 1,100 vehicles were supposed to be upgraded to the Mark 1A standard, but reality fell way short of those grand plans. Funding kept getting cut, technical problems piled up, and deadlines slipped by years. Bharat Electronics managed to produce a fire control system designated AL-4420, but it only made it onto a few hundred tanks. A more advanced system, the AL-4421 with a British laser sight and ballistic computer, went to even fewer vehicles. The Mark 1B and Mark 1C versions never got past the prototype stage, and the Mark II existed as a single prototype with composite armor. When all was said and done, no more than about 450 tanks received the Mark 1A fire control upgrade instead of the planned 1,000+, and the more ambitious Bison overhaul reached far fewer vehicles still. Alongside efforts to squeeze more life out of the aging fleet, Indian engineers came up with alternative uses for the tanks. Hulls from decommissioned Vijayantas got a second life as platforms for specialized vehicles. The most widely produced was the catapult self-propelled artillery system, where the tank hull was lengthened by one road wheel and fitted with an open armored superstructure housing a 130mm gun of Soviet design. The gun could reach out to 27 kilometers, making the catapult a serious fire support asset. 2 variants were produced, with the second getting beefed up ballistic protection to a level 2 standard. Another interesting spin-off was the Kartik bridge layer, also built on a lengthened chassis with 7 road wheels per side. The vehicle carried a folding bridge of Eastern European design, deployed hydraulically, that let tanks and heavy vehicles cross gaps up to 20 meters wide. By 2003, the Indian Army had taken delivery of 34 of these bridge layers. Around 200 hulls were turned into armored recovery vehicles with a crane capacity of 10 tons and a winch pull of 25 tons, replacing truly ancient recovery vehicles based on Sherman and Centurion chassis. In 1997, Command made the call to gradually phase the Vijayanta out of active service. First, 296 early production vehicles were pulled from duty. Then overhauls of remaining tanks were halted, and spare parts production had already been shut down back in 1989. The Vijayanta was replaced by T-72s produced under license in India as the Ajaya, which offered better firepower, protection, and mobility across the board compared to the aging Vijayanta. By 2008, the last frontline Vijayantas had left active units, but the story didn't end there. Retired tanks weren't sent to the scrapyard. They found an unexpected second career as static firing positions along the line of control with Pakistan in Kashmir. The tanks were dug into the ground up to their turrets, turning them into well-protected gun emplacements. In February 2019, when tensions between India and Pakistan spiked sharply after the Pulwama attack and retaliatory airstrikes, these old veterans opened fire on enemy positions once again. The Vijayanta, by then over half a century old, kept on serving even after its official retirement. If you enjoyed this story about a tank with a grand name and a complicated legacy, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos about legendary military vehicles. Drop a comment about which tank or fighting vehicle you'd like to hear about next, and we'll definitely cover it.